My name is Sam McAleese. I am a pediatrician and a neonatology fellow in Baltimore, Maryland. I graduated from Northwestern University in 2010 and received a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy. I did my circumnavigation in 2009, and my topic of research was local engagement in national parks, looking at how national parks engage Native communities and indigenous communities. I was sponsored by the Chicago chapter of the Circumnavigators Club. On my circumnavigation, I visited Peru, Chile, Australia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Tanzania, and South Africa. My first stop on my circumnavigation was the country of Peru, and really with a focus on the Amazon and a national park in the Amazon called Manu National Park, as well as Machu Picchu. I had some pretty amazing experiences, even within the first week of starting my circumnavigation. I was invited again, this is the amazing kind of network that that you kind of build through the circumnavigators trip, is that, again, got introduced to the mayor of one of the local towns that surrounds Machu Picchu in the national park there, and got to have a dinner with him and some of his close kind of advisors and councils, and to just talk very frankly about what their fears were for increased use of the park, what their fears were for kind of the long-term stability, environmental stability, the infrastructure needs, the health needs for their community. And that was something that was completely unplanned. I think a few days later, to go from that high point to then maybe even another one where when I was actually in Manu National Park, and just happened to come across a group that's based in the United Kingdom that is called the Cape Farewell Project, that was trying to use artists and authors and photographers to try and find new ways to impact climate change and cause a broader cultural shift in how we think about climate change. And so got to actually meet, again, the head of the UK Greenpeace at the time, and got to meet Jan Martel, one of my favorite authors, who were there on this project to kind of understand what the work was going on in Manu and the impact that climate change was having on this national park and these communities. And to be able to just brainstorm with them and brainstorm with these communities that we were staying with was a pretty powerful experience. And again, not something that had been planned at all. So very, it was even though it was very early in my trip, was one of the highest points for sure. One of my first stops in Peru was in Manu National Park, which is an extremely biodiverse national park in the Amazon of Peru, in the cloud forest. And while I was there, I was fortunate enough to kind of work with and partner with a group called the McAleese Learning Center, which is kind of a non-governmental organization that's has a kind of a few different missions. One of which is research, so environmental research, conservation research, biologic research, looking at biodiversity, looking at species. They're very famous for their macaws in Manu National Park, so get a lot of researchers coming down for that. They also do community programs, so community farming outside Manu National Park with some of the local communities, as well as an ecotourism business. And so it's a really nice model for how communities that aren't just indigenous communities, right? So communities that are newer to the kind of area, and how they complement and really advocate for indigenous land rights, advocate for environmental protection, and really is a powerful, when they're there, can be a powerful advocate for these national parks. They are really struggling in Manu National Park with kind of the relationship or the concern for development of oil reserves in and around the park. And so, McAleese has really been important and kind of instrumental in helping the indigenous and local communities help address some of those concerns and engage the government and engage these companies in a way that maybe they didn't have the expertise for. So, was so thankful to get to kind of have them help me navigate some of those relationships and introduce me to kind of partners on both sides. On my circumnavigation, I was fortunate enough too to when you're studying national parks, you get to spend a lot of time in national parks, which are just a wonderful place to travel and to explore. And so while I was in Chile, got to just, and really everywhere, tried to do as much hiking, as much, exploring as my schedule allowed in between interviews. And so Chile was just absolutely stunning. Again, not quite, didn't have enough time to get all the way down to some of the national parks in Patagonia, but even right around Santiago in kind of the middle of the country. So it's a pretty close to some large cities and pretty populated areas. You have very remote kind of hiking and wilderness that you can get to. And so, you know, even in my spare time was, a lot of my activity would be around, exploring these parks on my own, and really experiencing them as a tourist, as a hiker, and it was a pretty wonderful kind of way to augment the research that I was doing. Every park was unique in its own way. Kakadu National Park is one of the largest parks in Australia, which has a very robust national park system and has a really robust system for engaging Aboriginal tribes in the management of the parks. And so Kakadu National Park is actually owned by Aboriginal tribes, and it's actually leased back to the Australian government for management, for kind of a long-term lease. I think this is really a microcosm for the fraught relationship between local communities and governments around national parks, that you see kind of everywhere, because in the kind of signing document that kind of established the national park and set up this leasing program for the Australian government, there's also a kind of caveat that the Australian government also gets to carve out a very valuable portion of Kakadu National Park to build a uranium mine. And so you get this very unique situation. It's been in operation for decades, that you're in the middle of this pristine, beautiful national park with kind of cultural heritage sites, these Aboriginal worship sites very close by, and then you have a extremely large uranium pit mine that is, that was active at the time. And it's just this juxtaposition of it. And, I think it really speaks to, it's something that even in the US that we see, that, this juxtaposition between, preservation of pristine wilderness and, knowing that that's a loaded term, and then also the use of land and the use of resources for development for communities. And so that one kind of visit and talking with the park rangers who have to patrol the mine, and the Aboriginal leaders who are upset with it, its proximity to their cultural sites, with the environmentalists who are upset with its impact on the local water and the local wildlife. Really just is I could have spent all 90 days just at that one site to really kind of understand how parks and communities interact. During my circumnavigation, there were quite a few points where you have downtime, where you're in between meetings. Anyone who's traveled, and any circumnavigator member will absolutely know these moments where your bus doesn't leave for another day, and you have an extra 6 hours, 8 hours to kind of wander, and not enough to do something big, but just enough to walk the streets, to meet people, to eat some food, and kind of immerse yourself in that town. Halong is one of the towns that's right on Halong Bay, which is a very famous kind of national park in Vietnam, with a lot of water and beautiful scenery. But Halong itself is actually a fairly industrial and working class town, and pretty large. And so, again, the juxtaposition of this really large kind of port town right next to this large national park is pretty striking. And I found myself again in between meetings at about 8 to 12 hours to myself. And I don't speak Vietnamese, and my one of my close friends who I'd kind of met, who was helping arrange some meetings for me, and who was helping kind of direct me in Vietnam, wasn't available. So got to just kind of wander through the streets, and you find these small moments of just like wonderful camaraderie with people who don't share a language with you, but share again just a joy of games, a joy of music, and so was walking and again first kind of just stopped. This was later in my trip. Stopped at a local barber shop and just kind of watched him cut hair for a little bit, and then again just pointed to a chair, and he said, he kind of nodded, and so I sat down and he cut my hair, and again kept talking. I hope not to me in Vietnamese because I didn't understand anything, but talking to his friends and the other customers. And then, after the haircut was done, I just opened my wallet and he took what was the fair going price, and we went on our way. And it was just this like wonderful, and I can't even say it was a barber shop. It was literally just a chair that he had plugged in to kind of the local street lamp, had his tools plugged into the local street lamp. So, after I got my haircut and was feeling pretty good, wandered into one of the local parks where some of the kind of older gentlemen seemed to kind of congregate during the day and during the afternoons when it was pretty hot and most people were either working or kind of at home, and they in the shade would just play kind of a local domino based game. Again, I had seen mahjong before. It wasn't that. It wasn't the kind of classic dominoes that I knew. And so, it's just kind of standing, watching over their shoulder, and there's, multiple people that are just kind of watching and just trying to figure out the rules, and you think you understand it. And then all of a sudden, the game's completely over and you have no idea what's going on. So it was moments like that were, some of the best moments for me. Again, kind of unplanned in between some of the actual work that I was doing. My circumnavigation was very instrumental in understanding my research project and looking at how parks are engaging local communities, because national parks are national. They're often prescribed by national governments, by bureaucracy that's having that kind of just overnight will create a national park that covers in some places areas and communities that have lived there for hundreds of years. And so to really understand how those communities have engaged in the park, both economically, how they're engaged in it administratively, uh, really takes getting to be on the ground. And I think a great example of that is in Tanzania, really in all the countries where it was, but say in Tanzania, where you have Maasai communities who are involved in the park, both from a tourism and an ecotourism standpoint, and some of their communities that work with tourism companies, but also with game management. And so the reality that the communities are finding on the ground with what's available for them as far as resources, as far as animals, hunting rights, is very different from what the communities are saying compared to what the park policies are saying. And so really at every site that I circumnavigated to, every country that I worked, that I went to, and every park that I went to, really kind of hit that home of how the reality of what a community is facing goes way beyond just the kind of park on paper. My first day on my circumnavigation, I was flying into Cusco, Peru, which the timing was wonderful. It was and somewhat planned, but also somewhat fortuitous that there was a large celebration, both for the kind of local festival, celebrating kind of an equinox or not celebrating one of the solstices, and some of the just local festivals. And so I get off my plane, I have all my stuff, and my hostel is right off the kind of main square in Cusco. But there are about 15,000 people packed into the streets around it and into the square just celebrating the festival. And it's wonderful. And there's, marches and parades from the local schools, and people in traditional dress and garb and celebrating kind of their heritages. Um, and as it's true anywhere in the world, when you have that many people, that there's people that are looking to take advantage. And so of course, when you're just getting this kind of crush, trying to get through a crowd, and I'm trying to keep track of my big backpack, and then my my cell phone, and my like kind of day pack. And again, you get to your hostel, and I'm like, all right, I've got my passport, got my wallet. I did well. I got through it, had no problems. And then I'm like, wait, where's my day pack with my with my cell phone? And it was gone. And you have a little bit of a breakdown. And then you just say, you know what, it happens, and it's fine, and it's just a cell phone. And it's, again, it just goes to speak to how wonderful people are to help you, that again, you can have somebody's phone to, again, figure out where, to call one of my local contacts to find out where kind of an internet cafe was, so that I could go on and email my mom and cry a little bit. And then also, try and figure out how to come up with a plan to get another phone locally. So it all worked out fine. One of the, low points for me during my circumnavigation were definitely some of just the travel difficulties. Which trying to coordinate all of the flights, all of the bus rides, all of the rental cars, for a 90-day trip was tough. And we tried to arrange as much as I could beforehand, and so had most of my flights already kind of booked. And I showed up for my last flight from Australia to Malaysia, actually, and it was one of the later flights in the day. And I was flying first to Kuala Lumpur, and then had some connecting flights to some of the smaller national parks in Borneo. So actually not even on the same island as Kuala Lumpur, so over in Borneo. And I show up, and I'm looking around, and it's Australia. So again, everything's in English, so it's not as difficult as when you're trying to travel in a place where they have a whole different alphabet. And I just can't see the sign for my airline. And so I'm kind of walking back and forth, and it's gotten burned before. Oh, it's in a different terminal. And so half an hour goes by, and I just still can't find anything. And I finally go up to the information, and I'm like, hey, I'm trying to find my flight. Maybe it's under a different airline. They just they're sister carriers. And they're like, huh. And they look, and they can't find it, and they send me to another information desk. And then they're like, huh, we don't have any flights today for this airline. And I was like, when's the next flight? And they're like, oh, there aren't any flights. And then and then you start trying to look into it more, and you go back and realize that the whole airline had gone bankrupt about a month and a half ago. And so I had no flights, and I had a connecting flight in 8 hours, or in 12 hours from Kuala Lumpur. So it's one of those where you kind of scramble. And one of the few times where I was glad I had kind of planned ahead and built kind of a cushion, so that I could afford one of the more expensive last minute tickets to get to Kuala Lumpur. But it was also, I think those kind of moments. There was another one in Vietnam where kind of a low travel point for me, where the airline, I get to my gate, and they say the flight is canceled, but I still see people boarding a plane through my gate. And I ask, like, where's that plane? And I asked some of the people, and they said, oh, we're going to, we're flying from Saigon to Hanoi. It's one of these in Vietnam, one of these local ones. And they're like, oh yeah, that's the flight that we're supposed to be on. And I go back up to the tape, to the desk, and they say, oh no, look at our computer, there's no one on this flight. I'm like, but can I get on the board? Can I just get on the plane anyway? And fortunately, not having any carried bags, it was one of those where it's just kind of you just kind of beg forgiveness and end up getting on what was actually my flight, and just kind of a miscommunication, but very easily could have been a missed connection. My experience in Doha was completely fine. Again, I the some of the lowest points, and this speaks to just how wonderful the trip is, that the lowest points are kind of mostly inconveniences more than anything truly kind of disturbing. You Whenever you're traveling between continents, I think it's very easy to end up with a long layover. And when I was in Doha, I had a 12-hour layover and had just been doing a ton of interviews and had been running around a lot right before that. And so it's actually looking forward to just kind of sleeping for a little bit, finding an abandoned corner, an abandoned bench in the airport, and just kind of closing my eyes for a while and catching up on sleep. And unfortunately, it was the coldest I think I've ever been in my life. The air conditioning was on full blast, and you couldn't find a single place that didn't have a vent right over you. And so I don't think I slept more than about 5 minutes at any point while I was in that airport trying to find some sleep. On my circumnavigation, I met so many amazing people, too many to count. I think the warmth that people, the willingness they had to share their lives, their homes, their food, their time with me was truly amazing. David Reese and his wife were circumnavigators that hosted me in Brisbane. So about as far away from home on my trip as I'd been, kind of right in the middle, right when I'm starting to kind of feel, I think, the most loneliness from traveling alone for such a prolonged period of time. And David and his wife really took me under their wing, picking me up from the airport, cooking me home cooked meals, helping me with my laundry, showing me around their city and how proud they were of their city, sharing their circumnavigation stories with me. And was just one of those wonderful people that, you meet, and within a few minutes, you already feel like you're good friends and close friends with them. And so just uh, so appreciated their warmth in the middle of my trip. My circumnavigation trip really was built on research that I had started even before my circumnavigation. So I worked at Northwestern with Dr. Paul Friesma, who was an amazing environmental policy researcher and teacher at Northwestern, and worked with him in a national park in Alaska, actually, and looking at how a local community um, really engaged in that park, and how they were instrumental in doing some of the monitoring and some of the kind of scientific work of the park in that community. And that really led to my circumnavigator project, kind of the genus of it. I think when I came back from my circumnavigation, so it was also continuing that work with Dr. Friesma, but then also trying to kind of build on that in my local community. There aren't really any national parks in Chicago, but that doesn't mean that there aren't communities interacting with nature and with the natural world. And so I started working at the Field Museum in Chicago, and looking at an ethnography project at how different local communities within Chicago, just on a neighborhood level, or say the Polish community, were reacting and responding to climate change and adapting to climate change. So that really did shape kind of what not just my academic work in my senior year, but also then the opportunities that I had after graduation. My circumnavigation in the kind of first year or two after graduation really was instrumental in opening doors for me as far as career opportunities. I think the environmental policy is a small community, and having worked on this really did help me kind of both with the networking, but then also in just kind of honing what my interests were in my career, and the type of opportunity that I sought out in those first year or two. Um, I think I transitioned away from kind of environmental policy as the main focus of my career, and towards medicine. But even after that transition, which you would say in a lot of ways has nothing to do with my circumnavigation, has continued to really impact me professionally. Even when I do interviews for my physician jobs and my training, my circumnavigator trip comes up just from a personal skill standpoint of, again, helping from a research standpoint. How do you write grants? How do you publish your research? How do you communicate your work? How do you build relationships with partners overseas? So, the skills that I learned on it have continued to impact me professionally. Um, they've continued to impact kind of where my interests lie. So, clinical medicine, um, with an interest for me in global infectious disease. And so, my research is already starting to partner with researchers in India and other low resource settings. Just having already kind of grown to love that travel, learn to love kind of working in these other settings with these partners who bring such a different experience to me. After I graduated from Northwestern in 2010, I initially was working in environmental policy, really as a continuation of my circumnavigators work, looking at national park policy and looking at how they were working in the US, how parks and how government was kind of engaging communities, both urban communities and then also more rural communities. What I came to realize just through volunteer service and as well as just kind of my career was that what I really was interested in was the communities themselves and the health of the communities and how it was impacted by the environment. And so over a few years, kind of transitioned from working in environmental policy to working in public health and spent some time abroad working in Haiti on some public health initiatives to fight some parasitic diseases. And then from there, transitioned to clinical medicine with a focus on pediatrics and neonatal medicine. My career right now, my research interest is in global infectious disease. And so partnership building is really important, which has been so much harder to do virtually. And so I think my circumnavigation, the warmth with which I was received by communities that have a lot of distrust of outside researchers, that have distrust of foreigners, was unbelievable, and it just really hit home for me how important that those relationships are to my growth, and really shaped kind of where my career interests are, and how I'm pursuing my career now. My circumnavigation really did help me understand myself better. And some of that is still, even to this day, some of those lessons I'm still learning. I think especially with the COVID pandemic and not being able to travel and not being able to make those relationships, really hit home for me how important kind of building relationships, that kind of friendship, that empathy, that kind of underlines a lot of what my career research or my career interests are, how important that relationship building is. Personally, I think my circumnavigation has continued to have an impact on me, and just the way in which I want to spend my life, both continuing to travel as much as I can and surround myself with people who come from different backgrounds, who come with different experiences. I think that's one of the joys of living in a city like Washington, D.C. is that people travel to me in so many ways. So even when I'm not able to travel because of work or a pandemic, that I'm still able to kind of experience the joy and just the wonderful world that we live in that I really first experienced during my circumnavigation. Since my circumnavigation, I tried to stay involved in the Chicago chapter while I was still living in Chicago. I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2011, and so kind of became involved with the Washington, D.C. chapter. Briefly served as our club secretary and going to events, trying to arrange some more informal events with the DC chapter, just given how many museums we have and how many opportunities for kind of cultural engagement and what a multicultural city this is. I know right now I'm currently working in Baltimore, which has made it harder to kind of participate in club activities, but certainly looking forward to getting back to them as soon as I can. For me, staying involved in the club and club activities has really been inspirational to continue to try to build a life that prioritizes travel, that prioritizes the kind of principles that the Circumnavigators Club was built on. I think it's very easy to get caught up in your work, in your career, in your in life as it is at home, and the most inspirational people that I meet at club are the other members, not even the speakers, the other members who, again, are inspirational in the life that they've created for themselves, that still prioritizes traveling, that still prioritizes meeting new people and exploring new cultures, new experiences, and to just kind of have that constant reminder of what your life can be and the stuff that's important to you is pretty powerful. I think the speakers they arrange are also just a wonderful addition for my, for learning, for when I can't travel to some places or can't kind of experience things, to get to know them through that. So just have found it to be a really rewarding group of people. If I were pitching the Around the World Circumnavigator grant to a college, freshman or sophomore, uh, I would sell it as it is a study abroad. It is a research thesis. It is it is the best experience that you're going to have wrapped into one in college. It was absolutely the best experience that I had in the 4 years that I spent at Northwestern. And that's amongst a lot of very good experiences, but just the opportunity to develop a project yourself and to see it through, and to build a network of friends and colleagues that are interested in the same work as you is life changing. And to be able to do that in college, I think is an unbelievable gift. My advice for future grantees is to be flexible. I think that's the most important kind of characteristic that you can have as a traveler, as a researcher. Again, there's the just very obvious flexible in your travel plans, when your flights get canceled, when your car shows up and it's a manual transmission when you thought it was an automatic, and you're driving on the other side of the road, and so you're driving your stick left-handed, and trying to be flexible. When you don't have a place to sleep and you're trying to find, where am I can I sleep in my car tonight? Because again, my hostel was closed and there isn't anywhere, nearby this national park, and you're in the middle of nowhere. Being flexible in your kind of attitude too, I think, is also really important. Being flexible to I think being flexible means being open to new opportunities, to new experiences, to new ideas. I think from my research standpoint and for future grantees, you plan so much of it, and the internet and WhatsApp and communication across borders has gotten so easy. But there's so much that you don't know until you get there, and there's so many people that you don't even know that you should try to meet until you get there. And so being flexible and building some kind of free time in your schedule so that you can schedule that last minute meeting with the tribal leader that your contact says, oh, you absolutely have to meet them, and they just happen to be in town tomorrow, so can you meet them? So having that kind of flexibility serves your research really well. In applying for the Circumnavigators grant, you really do get a crash course in a few different really tangible skills. It's grant writing, it's project formulation, it's travel planning, it's networking, which I think is an underappreciated skill. How do you cold call people who are in a field that you want to talk to, that you need to interview with, that have no reason to help you out besides generosity, right? So that kind of networking skill, I think, is really underappreciated. So there's a lot of those tangible skills that you learn. You also, it really pushes you developing a project to kind of reflect on what your interests are, which I think when you're already at kind of a formulative time in college, to then reflect on your personal goals, to talk about it with your mentors, really will jumpstart kind of that big transition that happens after you graduate. My final thoughts, knowing that this is 50 years, is that um, 50 years of the grant program, is that I just am so honored to have been a part of it. It was one of the best experiences of my life, and just continue to revisit it through stories, through photos, through my report, through the relationships that I built, and just continue to be inspired by the people that I've met through it. So can't thank the club and the foundation enough for the support then and now.